governor's recommendation. So this will be highlights of our operating budget, our one-time spending, and also our capital budget. And thank you, JL, for pushing us through these slides today. So the next slide is really providing a historical context on how we have managed our budget in the past and how we're managing our budget today. So if you look at the graph, the yellow line is basically indicative of our revenue growth over time, but the blue line is where we've grown our budget. So if you're looking at fiscal year 16 through 18, you see that in the past, we basically grew our budget based off of revenue. So when revenues were up, we would go slightly up. If revenues were down, then our budget went down. Since then, we've moved to a model where we receive a recommendation from DFAC. So Executive Order number 21 from the governor basically said that we'll have an entity that will look at our revenue projections and look at various factors and make an actual recommendation as to how much the budget should grow. So you'll see that over time, our budget growth has been pretty stable, while revenues have gone up and down, especially after COVID. But the good thing about that is it shows you that when our revenues dipped significantly low, we weren't having to increase taxes or cut programming because of the way that we have sustained our budget. So this kind of just gives you an idea of how our budget moves currently. The next slide kind of goes over how we manage our plan. So we fully fund the rainy day fund, which is a constitutionally mandated, basically a savings account that requires that we put a 5% aside in the beginning. We always appropriate less than 98% of our revenues. We build our budget based off of that DFAC benchmark. And we also have another account, which I basically call another savings account that doesn't have the same constitutional restrictions as the rainy day fund, which is the budget stabilization fund. So right now we have fully funded budget stabilization and the rainy day fund, and BSF has $421 million in there. So again, it kind of allows us as the state just to kind of remain in a very good financial position. Then it also allocates $664 million in cash to the bond bill. So the next slide is going to give you all of our high level numbers, which are the numbers that people tend to look for. So even though DFAC benchmark was 6.1%, and DFAC comes back and does this about 3 or 4 times a year. So the last benchmark was 6.1%. We did grow the budget to 7.4. We were able to do that again because of the fact that we have a fully funded rainy day fund. We have a fully funded budget stabilization fund. And so the governor was able to kind of focus on some priorities, which we'll talk about later when it comes to state employee and teacher pay. And then also tax policy, which we'll go into. But if you look at this, so we have $5.4 billion in our operating budget. We have $59 million going into grant aid, $1.2 billion to bond and capital. This isn't our largest bond bill in history, but I believe it's still the top 5. So it's still a pretty large bond budget. And then also we have our one-time supplemental of $324 million. You'll see that that includes OPEB, which is $51 million. The financial plan also sets aside the $18.9 million for budget stabilization fund. And then the plan also accounts for that tax policy, which is a revenue reduction of $24.9 million. But I will go into the tax policy in a later slide.
Brenda, before you move on, I'm sorry, do you mind defining OPEB for those that are sort of playing along at home?
Sure. Delaware is full of acronyms, right? Other post-employee retirement benefits. So basically OPEB is for our retirees and their benefits. So we set aside 1% of that. And so that 1% is $51 million.
Great, thank you.
Sure. And then the next chart is just, it's beautiful to look at, and it kind of gives you an idea of how, funding is kind of broken down between the various buckets. So obviously our operating bucket is going to be the largest. Capital, fluctuates. Like I said, we're the top 5 largest, but, it kind of fluctuates based off of, the high level of revenue that we have. And then, we have budget stabilization, grant and aid, one time, all up in there. Okay. So The next slide is really just talking about the governor's priorities. So we're strengthening our economy. So you'll see that there's those same pockets of economic growth that, with Delaware Prosperity Partnership and, bringing businesses to Delaware, but also, workforce initiatives. We're investing in public schools. Last year's budget had over $300 million of school construction. But so that number has gone down for this year, especially because of inflation and market pressure. But we are still making investments in public education and schools, and we'll talk about that as well. We continue to support families, and of course, our environmental initiatives. There's a lot of federal funding that has been allocated to that space, but of course, the state continues to support that as well. Next slide also talks about some of, the highlights you'll see. Yeah, thank you. So we are continuing to work towards our compensation and pay equity for state employees. This was something that we started last year. And so we continue to work towards that as well. We'll go into that. But this also includes an increase for our classroom teachers, really in alignment with the work of the Public Education Compensation Committee. They're still in the process of making recommendations, but this is kind of in alignment with us taking those first steps towards it. We continue to increase opportunity funding for our high needs learning students. We have historic investments this year in affordable housing programs and incentives, both, federal dollars and state dollars. Again, we continue to support economic development and infrastructure and clean water and environmental issues. So the next slides are kind of bucket highlights, and I'll go into some detail for some of these. So when it comes to public education, so we have a total of a 9% raise for teachers, and that's for classroom teachers. We have a 3% raise for public education, those who work in public education. We have an increase of $15 million to the Opportunity Fund, which brings our total to $53 million. And we have a $3 million investment into the Wilmington Learning Collaborative, which brings our total to $10 million. The next slide goes into our environmental initiatives. So, I'll just start with clean water, because clean water was a huge number last year. We got a lot of federal funding that was in there. And so we still have federal funding coming into clean water. So we have $26.2 million that goes towards clean water and drinking water. Open space and ag lands at $10 million, which is historically where they are, as well as shoreline and waterway resiliency at 7.5. I will just note that open space and ag lands, there's an opportunity for us to increase those numbers, leveraging federal funds, but they're still pending in that area. Next, we have, our economic development buckets of funding. So strategic fund is at 25 million, I believe is at 20 million last year. Site readiness, again, at 10 million. Graduation lab space, which, really provides space to some of the businesses that we have coming into the state. And so, to make sure that they have the facilities that they need. And then we have the transportation infrastructure investment fund at 5 million. So now we're going to get into more of the details. So our tax policy for this year, as I mentioned before, it's a cost of $24.9 million in fiscal year 24. And because that's 6 months annually, it's a cost of $55.7 million. So this tax policy increases the standard deduction by 75%. So now an individual would be $5,700. And then jointly $11,400. It also increases the refundable earned income tax credit to 7.5. I believe it was at 4.3 previously. And so this tax policy is effective in 23, where the standard deduction is also effective in 24. So this is going to have a pretty significant impact on a few of the 50,000 tax filers would be switching to standard deduction. So this is going to have a significant impact, because right now we have individuals who have to choose between a standard deduction or itemizing. So this tax policy should be helpful. I'm not a tax person. This is really Department of Finance. So if you need some questions in this area, you can send them to me and I'll make sure that we get you some answers. So the next slide is really talking about our state workforce. I'm sure people have been aware of, people's concerns about, retiree benefits, and we kind of talked about OPEB already. So it's $194 million to kind of fill this gap. So $143.2 million is necessary to fill the shortfall for group health insurance. And then again, we're investing $51 million in one-time funding to OPEB in order to kind of work on decreasing our unfunded liability. Then we get to state wages. So as I noted before, last year we started a policy of trying to get our state employees closer to, where the market is. That's a huge jump, but we're trying to take steps. So we're once again doing the same thing. So it's a 3 to 9% increase, with the lowest wage workers getting the 9%. On average, it's about a 6% wage increase for our state workers. It's also a historic wage increase for teachers. So it's a total of 9%. So 3% of our pay policy that is across the board, plus 6% of a supplement for classroom teachers specifically, like I said, in line with PECC and the work that they're doing. We also have funding to support recruitment and retention initiatives. So, one thing like this would not include individuals who are in the process of collectively bargaining. So we, try to develop incentives so that those individuals can still feel supported, but, they still have to go through the process of, negotiating their CBAs. And so this does not change that process for them. This does establish a $15 minimum wage for merit full-time state employees. And I try to say that clearly because that doesn't include casual seasonal employees whose pay is at the discretion of their agencies. It doesn't include, again, those who are currently collectively bargaining. And it doesn't include the local share of some of those public education positions. But it does get at least merit full-time employees would be at a minimum of $29,250, which is a $15 minimum wage. So we're doing that a little earlier than the law requires it, which requires that we all get there by January 1st of 2025. So these are just some examples. The pay policy can be kind of complicated. So as far as, teacher pay, like this is just an example of how it might work or how it does work for a few classifications. So we'll just look at the bachelor level. So right now, the base is $31,000. As I said, there's a 6% supplement that has been added to teacher pay, which would be, $1,902. So then you have the state share, which is 70% versus the local share of 30%. So state will get that individual at least to $33,000, but then the locals are going to be responsible for, paying their share. So assuming that everything is paid on the local side as well, that teacher would go from $31,692 to $47,991. And so there's some other examples there for you if you're interested in seeing that. So then we're going to get into early childhood development. So we do have a purchase of care rate increase. So there was the 2021 market rate study. And so we have gotten to 100% of the 75th percentile, which is a total of $10.3 million. We also have funding for a federal preschool development grant. That grant is really to help us study what is happening in our state as far as preschool and what we can do to actually effectively have a positive impact in that space. It will help us determine, where resources really need to go, how to properly do that. So it's a grant that's going to help us get there. Additionally, there is basically double funding to ECAP. So it's an increase of $6.1 million. I'm bringing the total to $12.2 million, which is going to expand early care and education for 3 and 4-year-old children. And then we also have Representative Williams's bill, HB 33. which would implement modified basic special education student teacher ratios. And so that's $3.9 million going to that to adjust those student teacher ratios for preschool students. So next we're talking about higher education. So we have the 60 million, so 20 million to UD, to Del State, and to Del Tech for, maintenance and capital improvements. There is a new program, a joint engineer program between Del State and University of Delaware to increase engineers in the state, in particular minority engineers in the state. We're in the third year of Del Tech's compensation stabilization plan. So similar to what we were trying to do with state employees, with bringing them to closer to a market rate. Del Tech has been working on this plan over time. And so they're in year 3. So there's 900,000 that's gone to that. And then we've, increased funding to, the various scholarships. So with the ultimate goal of each institution having their own standalone needs-based scholarship, but right now we have a $1.4 million increase to Promise, $4 million increase to Seed, plus which is broken down between Del Tech and UD, and then $1.7 million to Inspire. So back to, opportunity funding. So we have added another $15 million to our opportunity funding, which brings us to $53 million. Last year, Representative Longhurst had, HB 100 and HB 300, which created mental health student centers in elementary and middle schools. So we have $30 million going to support that. The Governor's Family Support Cabinet or Family Services Cabinet Council is basically a collaboration of various agencies who, interact with children and families and trying to develop a holistic approach. And so there is some funding towards the Governor's fellowship program and a position for a statewide mentoring coordinator. And then as I mentioned earlier, there's another $3 million that is going into the Wilmington Learning Collaborative, which brings the total to $10 million to support those education improvement initiatives in the city of Wilmington. On our environmental slide, we have, our cover crop investment of $5 million to support, climate and water quality. Teddy, which is, a fun name and pretty popular within, our governor's office. So Teddy is a tree for every Delawarean. So we have some funding between DNREC and the Department of Agriculture to continue to support that program. We have $600,000 that's going towards our statewide groundwater monitoring network. So, trying to reduce contaminants and including PFAS. And there was a lot of conversation about PFAS last year in legislative session. And then we have $2.9 million that's going towards supporting lead assessment and remediation. So $2 million of that is, in one-time funding, and then $900,000 is in operating. And then additionally, we have, funding to, again, protect our waterways and keep them clean. So you have $18 million in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and 1.7 in the conservation cost share. So now jumping to housing. So this is a historic investment in housing this year and affordable housing this year. So this $101.5 million includes state funding. It includes federal funding. So state operating and then also state capital. And I will kind of break that down in our next slides. So these are basically the federal buckets. So there's $60 million in ARPA fund that's going towards these 4 funds. So this isn't just, a voucher program. Like, these funds are very specific. So the Catalyst Fund is for construction loans for the redevelopment of vacant and blighted properties. This is being offered in partnership with Sonera Lending Corporation. The Accelerator Fund is basically 2-part. So the first is an incentive to market rate developers with planned construction projects in exchange for affordable rental unit set-asides. And then so we have the developers committing to an affordable monthly rental unit rate for a specific number of units. The Market Pressure Relief Fund is basically additional funding to owners of affordable multifamily rental properties who are currently dealing with construction cost increases due to supply chain and inflation. And then we have the Preservation Fund, which supports existing affordable housing units through, repairs and rehab and financial restructuring. So we have the $60 million from ARPA, but then we also have $30 million that will support those specific funds. The next slide is going to break down where the $1.5 million is going. So if we go there, the $1.5 million is really supporting housing policy. So Senator Lockman's Landlord Mitigation Fund is funded at $150,000. We have Senator Townsend's right to counsel for eviction proceedings for tenants, which is funded at $1.15 million. And then Representative Sherry Dorsey Walker's bill that's currently in this legislative session that would allow for tenants who are dealing with landlords who are not making repairs or there's defects in the building. It would allow for them to make their rent payments to the JP court in an escrow account until it's resolved. So then we're going to jump into our capital slides. So, it's still a huge number in school construction, smaller than what it was last year, but still pretty big. So it's a total of $191 million. 93 million is market pressure. And so we really didn't start any new projects. We kind of slowed down, obviously, on some of them, but we have projects in Newcastle and Sussex County that we're working on. We talked about higher ed and MCI. We talked about, strategic fund, site readiness, graduation space. So these are just some of the buckets of funding that we continue to have in our capital budget. And so those are just some of those numbers in those spaces. Next, we talk about building strong communities. So we have some investments in some of our historical sites, recreational sites, including, museums and Fort Miles and Fort DuPont. We have some work on some libraries. So the Rehoboth Library, there's a library in Brady 100, Milford, Newark. So we're working on some of those spaces. And we talked about the environmental funding with clean water and drinking water, farmland, preservation, open space. That's 10 million that comes directly from the real estate transfer tax. And so we continue to make those kinds of key investments in the environment. And then our next slide is, talking about, what we're doing with, our community. So this should be the final funding that's necessary for the Canton Sussex Family Courthouse. So we're hoping that project will be ready to go soon, but this should be the last installment, hopefully. We continue to work as far as courts wise, we're working with the Customs House, which will be the future home to the community court. And then there's also funding that goes towards our corrections facilities for different areas. And then we have, funding for the Delaware Hospital for the chronically ill. That is basically an ARPA funded project, but it did require that there needed to be some state funding invested in that, again, because of market pressure and inflation. So that's the highlights of our capital budget. So let me just come back to these, larger buckets of numbers. So this is where we are. And then the next slide is just really about the process. So the process is the same every year. So, right now the governor's recommended budget went out on Thursday. And so now we start JFC tomorrow. The Joint Finance Committee hearings. And so we will hear from the various agencies. They'll answer questions about what their budgets include. Then we also do the same process with the capital budget. And then we go through the markup process when, the legislator has the ability to make, certain changes to the budget. And then the goal is always to have the budget passed by June 30th because our fiscal year starts on July 1. So that was a lot of information, but happy to try to answer any questions you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Brenda. So we did have the first question. could you explain in a little more detail opportunity funds?
Yeah, so opportunity funding is for English language learners and low income students. So the Opportunity Fund actually targets funding specifically to those communities. So schools that have higher percentages of those, which I call higher needs students. There's funding that goes towards supporting those students in those schools. So the schools that have larger populations get more funding, and it's just basically on a scale based off of where the students are located. We do have a goal of getting our opportunity funding, I believe, to 60 million by 2025. So we're moving much faster than people anticipated, being that we're already at 53 million, but the number will continue to increase.
Great. The next question we received was, where will the community court be located?
So right now, the community court is located in the Leonard L. Williams Justice Center. And so the Customs House building is like diagonal to it. And so it's in the same area, but the goal is to try to take the community court out of the courthouse. Community courts are typically, in the community. And, obviously it helps people feel, the courthouse kind of has like a punitive nature to it. And so if the community court is outside of the courthouse, which would include their resource center, which connects people directly to, community providers and things like that, hopefully that would all move into Customs House once it's prepared, once it's done.
We have a question relating to, could you please address cost of living adjustments for nonprofits that contract with state agencies to provide necessary services? Yeah, so I mean, we don't really do COLAs. What we do is our requests from our agencies, right? So I'm aware of the fact that DHSS made a request with one of their contractual lines to increase, and that was funded. And so we don't really go through the process of determining an increase for all nonprofits across the board. What we do is respond to the requests from specific agencies. So whatever agency a nonprofit will be working with, we would expect that to be a request from them. And then that's how it ends up being a part of the budget ultimately. Great. And then sort of partnered with that last question, can you help us understand what assumptions were made for door openers? And like define what a door opener is for folks, and what % increase were departments permitted for their regular services? So it's 1% that they were permitted overall. So it's not specific to, I guess, services. It's just an overall 1% budget growth is what we asked them to make their request. So that could be any part of their budget. As far as door openers are concerned, door openers are their specific buckets. So annualization. So there might be funding for something that maybe was only for 6 or 3 months in one fiscal year, but that has to continue. And so it has to be annualized. And so that's considered a door opener. Leases, like those payments have to be paid every year. There is one more category that I'm forgetting, but what I can do, we do outline very clearly what door openers are. And I know it can be confusing because if you've ever listened to a budget hearing with OMB, sometimes agency thinks something's a door opener that is not a door opener to us. So there's a confusion in that space, but I can point you directly to the document that outlines what is considered a door opener for you. That would be great. We can then, share that with folks after the event today. Mm-hmm. Super. So the next question is, how does the budgeted grant and aid recommendation compare to last year? Yeah, so this number is similar. So we're always around about 59.8. I think that, so as far as recommended, right? And then it can increase during the markup process. I think maybe it went to 61 million for markup last year. I'm not sure the exact number. But sometimes what happens is during the markup process, legislators might put some one-time funding in grant aid that ultimately will move out of the grant aid budget that might go into one-time funding or might end up going into the operating budget. So
our recommendation is similar, doesn't really change often, but it does change once you go through the markup process. And that is, up to the legislators.
Great. So a follow-up question to the door opener and percent increase question. So with a 1% increase for departments and 8% inflation, what areas are you seeing the departments are cutting to cover costs?
So I don't see them cutting costs in specific areas. I wouldn't know that. So the way it comes to us is that they make a request for certain things and they prioritize within that 1%. Sometimes they make requests beyond the 1%, but again, when they do, they're always required to prioritize their requests. So we look at their priorities and then we make decisions in that way. So as far as the specifics of their actual budget, they can make changes within the scope of what we provide them. So they have the opportunity to make changes within that larger number. So I can't speak specifically as to where agencies might be making those adjustments. We're kind of just with that larger bucket.
Great. So just a question around like engaging within the process. So there is a public opportunity for folks to testify during the OMB hearings that are held in the late fall. Mm-hmm. How does the agency take that information and utilize it?
Yeah, so I will say that at the point in which you are providing testimony, so the budget requests have been submitted, right? So an agency could decide they want to adjust the request that they've made to us. What I would say is the most impactful is when you are a part of that original budget request. So you really want to engage with agencies before they get to the public hearing portion. But yes, an agency could take in those comments and they could adjust their budget request to OMB. But I will just say that the most effective strategy would be to engage agencies prior to their budget requests so that you're a part of that consideration in the beginning. There's a few parts of that process. You have the budget hearings that OMB holds, and then there's a decision-making process that happens after that as well. So the earlier you can engage in that process, the more effective you're likely to be, in my opinion.
Great. So the next question is around projected revenue. So maybe you could speak to how projections happen and how that informs what then becomes the budget through DFAC. And so maybe if you could just cover that quickly, then I'll ask the specific question around projected revenue.
So I will tell you, DFAC is not my baby, but DFAC.
I understand. I think it's just how it informs the amount that you write the budget for. Right?
Yeah, so it's an independent entity, right? And they look at our various revenue sources. So our biggest revenue source really comes from corporations, but they look at our various revenue sources, taxes, all of that. And then they make projections. So there are specific factors that they look into that I don't know of because, again, not my space, but we do use their projections and the projections come over time. If you look at the budget process slide, we expect, projections again in March. So it's basically, we use that to make decisions. The General Assembly is going to use that number to make some of the decisions that they make as well. But I can point you to DFAC's website, and I'm sure it could give you the kind of information you're looking for.
Yes, and I will say, just as an aside, before I ask this very specific question, part of DFAC is a member of DFAC is Sheila Bravo, our president CEO of Dana. So, Sheila does participate in those conversations. So the very specific question, Brenda, is what is the projected revenue this year as compared to the state budget? Because the last 2 years revenue was over 1 billion. So where are we this year?
I feel like the last number I heard was like 600 million with an expectation that that number will increase. I could be wrong, but that is the last number that I heard.
Okay, super. So any other questions that folks have for Brenda on the governor's recommended budget? I have one last question for you, Brenda, and just, is there anything of note that nonprofits that is really intended for the nonprofit sector and could be pretty critical to us within this budget?
I can only really, what I did ask our budget team was if they could kind of comb through these different agency requests to let me know what is specific to nonprofits, or what they can tell is specific to nonprofits or would impact nonprofit providers. So I am going to get that information and send it over to you. I'm really only aware of the requests that came through DHSS. But again, from our perspective, we understand that the number that we associate with grant and aid essentially goes to nonprofits in most cases until maybe there's some adjustments. But yes, we would have to kind of look through those budget requests to see what might be specific to nonprofits, because there's not like an overall number that is just an allocation that's kind of divided. Like that's not kind of where we are beyond just the grant aid number. So I did ask that for that. And so I'll get it over to you when I have it.
Yes. And just as an aside, and this isn't really for you, but for our members who are on the call today, grant aid is in fact like a very small percentage of the money that really goes into nonprofits. The bigger investment is in those contracts that are supporting the services that nonprofits are providing on behalf of the state. So but grant aid is a great number to just take a look at but it's not the majority of the money that goes to nonprofits. So so I have one more question here, Brenda. I'm hearing that we should expect significant increases in Medicaid funding needs due to changes in pandemic allowances. How will this impact the state budget?
Sure. So the Medicaid number is $69 million is in this current budget for Medicaid. And so there is, I guess, I don't know if it's the right term, a roll-off period where there's going to be individuals where the eligibility is changing. And so there's going to be less individuals who are receiving those benefits. But yes, we did have to allocate $69 million to kind of cover those who are currently a part of the program.
Great. That's helpful context. Thank you. So if there are no other questions for Brenda, just give everybody a minute, see if anything hits in the chat box. But Brenda, we are so grateful for your time today and for walking us through the specific interests of the nonprofit sector as it pertains to the recommended budget. And we appreciate all the work you're doing at OMB.
Yes, thank you all so much. And like I said, I will get you information about the door opener definition, send you information about DFAC, and if any other questions come up, feel free to reach out.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Brenda. I don't know if everybody could just join me in thanking Brenda, like in the chat box. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time today. Okay. Now, next on our agenda is we are so excited to have Senator Nicole Poore join us today. Nicole has been a wonderful friend to the nonprofit sector, so we're very appreciative. And we are also very grateful that Senator Poore will walk us through today the bond committee and how they are working through community reinvestment funds, which re-entered the scene, I guess, is the best way to put it, 2 years ago, and what that process is and the appropriate way for our organizations to engage. And so I'm going to stop talking. Senator Poore, thank you so much for being with us today. And I just would love to turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. So nice to join you this morning. And thank you so much for the invite. So there's a lot to be said for where we are as far as the amounts of money that are coming in today. And certainly we had an increase with ARPA funds and different infusions to be able to allow us the ability to spread these dollars out. So I am happy to run through what it looks like to be behind the scenes in the bond committee. I think in my 10 years here, I've sat on every committee. And so it has been baptism by fire for sure. But it's also been some of the most amazing experiences that I've ever walked through in my professional career. So the bond committee is based on obviously the committee members, but it's all about capital improvements. It's not where you find your funding for grant and aid for your programs, right? It's all brick and mortar. And it's how do we infuse dollars back into the economy for growth and for not necessarily development, because that's where your grant and aid dollars come in, but more so for making sure that you have a landing pad for whatever your program is. It has been the first time in the last 2 years, which is super cool, is the 2 years prior, the bond committee was run by or chaired, co-chaired, and the controller general for the first time in history were all women. But, you know, as Gerald Hocker said on the Senate floor, if you want a job done, give it to women and it will get done. Sorry, gentlemen, on this call, I apologize. I don't mean to offend you, but that actually came from one of my colleagues, and rightfully so. So the first year as chair, we had the opportunity to infuse our economy with $1.3 billion worth of capital projects. And then last year, as co-chair and working closely with Representative Heffernan, who is a huge advocate for our nonprofits in the state of Delaware, also had the ability to infuse the economy with $1.4 billion. We are anticipating we could be somewhere around that same amount this year, which is exciting. But at the same time, our costs have increased as well. So it's a catch-22 on what's going to happen. But, you know, we had a lot of opportunity. And one of the things that had not taken place in a lot of years is something what we call community reinvestment funds. That's where the nonprofits got to ask for capital dollar improvements. And so we worked with last year roughly about $90 million. And we also, in the year from my first year as chair to my second year as co-chair, was we created an application process. We have an amazing controller general, and we have an amazing team of people that support her. One of the things that we found is that we needed to have, we needed the process to be an actual uniformed process. And we didn't have that walking into it because we hadn't done CRF dollars in years. So, so by creating this, this application process, it gives the ability to be able to see who's asking, how much they're asking for, ask pertinent questions to make sure it's relevant to capital dollars. And then we were able to disperse those dollars. I think one of the things that became really challenging for the bond committee last year is knowing that there were nonprofits that were told that they would get ARPA dollars. And so how did we make good, clear decisions and be able to stretch those dollars out? So it's not that the nonprofits that were told that they were going to get money shouldn't have had additional dollars, but it was a real struggle because we had so many applications come through. You know, we were trying to do allocations by the counties, by the reps and the senators, and really breaking that down. That is hours upon hours of literally trying to structure how the dollars are going to be spent. And so that was definitely on top of legislation, your session days, extra jobs, raising your families, it definitely takes a lot of time to be able to figure that out. But we had roughly about 186, 87 organizations that actually received dollars. And we had roughly, I think it was 27, 28 municipalities that also received additional dollars. So, I mean, total 187, 88 that got it, but it was about 160 nonprofits that received it, roughly about 27, 28 municipalities, giving us the total number of awards that went out.
So Nicole, can you help us understand, we've heard sort of through the grapevine that there will be changes to the process for 2023 in terms of eligibility. Can you speak to that at all?
I'm not sure that there are changes. I think that there have always been guidelines to applying. So under CRF, it's never guaranteed. So that is something that everybody needs to know. It is not guaranteed. It is only because of the dollars that the governor has submitted to the bond committee, to which joint finance has approved. So we're kind of like the third step down, right? The governor says, this is my wish list. This is what we need to accomplish in the state of Delaware. Joint finance is going to approve, not approve, figure out where the dollars need to go. And then the rest of that money gets shipped off to bond. And so depending on the amount of monies that are left over is what comes to the bond committee. And then we make that determination of how it's going to be spent. But, you have to be a nonprofit. You have to be a 501c3. You have to have financials. So there are definitely different things that will be requested to make sure that the organization, and also that the request is valid, related to capital projects.
Okay, great. Other questions for Senator Poore on the CRF process? So Senator, I'm going to ask a question while we wait for folks to type. Can you help me understand, like, what is the ideal advocacy process aside from the application for our organizations?
So my first and golden rule is the answer is always no unless you ask. And you have to know that there are 10 people ahead of you. So at least 10 people ahead of you by the time that you're asking. One of the things that I'm always telling people is that this job for any legislator is every single day. And so if you are waiting only to see us during session time, you are way too late. It is our responsibility to be responsive to you. And so somewhere along the line, you have to find us. Find a partner in someone's district. Oftentimes it also comes down to things that we all got in this job for a particular reason. And so, obviously those that know me know that I have a child with special needs, also know I spent 20 years in healthcare, know that I worked for a Fortune 500 company. I can go down a list of reasons that made me want to be able to give back to my community, but also having the experiences to be able to make rational decisions for the folks that I represent. And then, of course, living a totally different world. I straddle two worlds, the typical world and the world of disability. So always trying to figure out how we all fit in. That being said, it is, if you are representing an organization, I don't know what I don't know. So unless you're telling me and teaching me about it, I don't know what your priorities are. And I don't know where you fit in the world of bond dollars. So help me figure out what that is. And sometimes our schedules are crazy, right? So don't be alarmed. I book, and me personally, I am constantly filling my schedule because there's definitely someone that needs something and I want to know exactly what it is and how do I fit that in. And so I'm quick to say, let's grab coffee. My corporate dining room right now seems to be Starbucks at the Fashion Center. So don't be surprised if you catch me there or see me there. And I've been there for hours. Great location to be able to get some work done. But that being said, you have to be able to educate us on what it is that your priorities are, but I would not be shy about asking. And we are going to do our very best to be able to support each and every organization, which takes me back to, our largest distribution last year for bond dollars went to the food bank. And, we had a list of organizations that were supposed to be receiving ARPA dollars. We're finding out today that some of those organizations have not received their ARPA dollars. And granted, it's the Fed dollars that need to be released, but they have gone through the process. But in order for us to have been able to disseminate the dollars, and we were trying to balance that out of who was expecting ARPA dollars and who was not, that's where the focus was.
So that actually brings up a great question. So several organizations are still waiting for those ARPA awards. The governor's office notified agencies in April 2022 that they were recommended for funding, but the U.S. Treasury still hasn't approved Delaware's awards. Will those agencies be able to apply for the community reinvestment funds moving forward?
I absolutely would recommend that you apply.
Great. Okay.
Absolutely.
So can you help us understand what happens after the award? So what type of follow-up reporting is required if you are a recipient of these funds?
Yeah. So the Controller General will send you out a letter basically saying, congratulations. And then your monies will start being distributed. But basically what they'll do is they'll ask you for updates for where you are in your project. You do have up to 3 years to spend those dollars. That's how long the commitment is from the bond.
That's great. So is an organization able to apply each year for a project, regardless of whether they've received community reinvestment funding in the past?
Yeah, again, there is no limit to it. And what I would say is if the CRF dollars are there, then and you have a relevant project to capital improvements, I would submit.
Great. Sorry.
Keeping in mind, we increased from year 1 with CRF dollars to year 2 of requests because everybody caught on like, oh my goodness, I needed an HVAC, which everybody knew. If you sat in the meetings, that just about drove me crazy with how many people needed air conditioning systems because that seemed to be for whatever reason, that seemed to be the request. And I think it started coming out of the governor's office of like, hey, you can get ARPA dollars for air conditionings. And then all of a sudden people weren't getting HVAC's dollars through those funds. So they were coming to the bond committee.
So, and this is a question that is probably not within your scope, but I'm going to ask it and you can tell me whatever.
Sure.
But there is an issue where a lot of our nonprofit organizations, I know that we've sort of talked about this, but the ARPA issue where it's been provisionally awarded, but then there's no follow through. Are there any recommendations you can make for our organizations on how to address that?
So, I would just say that if you are in the know that you should be receiving money, then I would, me being me, I would probably have someone's phone number on speed dial in the administration asking where we are weekly.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. The reality is that, I always say this, there are 2 things that people don't care about. It's your money and your health. So it is, if you are representing an organization, it is your job and your responsibility to worry about that. And of course, if you're not feeling well, then it is your job to worry about your health too. So these are 2 things that no one else is going to be looking out for you in those particular areas. So you have to be the advocate.
Okay. So from the perspective of someone sitting on or has been a participant in the bond committee, what are what are the things that you wish, as you were sitting in deliberations, that our nonprofit organizations knew?
What is it that I think that you should know? Again, this goes back to building relationships with the legislators. I think that that is key, and not just in the 47 days that we're down in Legislative Hall, because oftentimes we're coming in, if session's starting at 2, we might be running in the door at 1 o'clock and trying to fit in as many people as possible based on what your schedule is from earlier in the day. Because it's, outside of a few legislators, everybody has a commute to Legislative Hall. So oftentimes it could be that you're hands-free on a conference call, having a call on your commute down there. So it's really about establishing those relationships. I am someone who gives out my cell number all the time. So when someone says to me, I can't get a hold of you, I'm like, oh, no. You absolutely can get a hold of me. There is no doubt about it, because if nothing else, you can text me and I'm going to text you back. But I think it's super important that establishing those relationships, so that way you can teach us about what it is that we don't know. I'm going to give an example. A few years ago, and now we have the senator sitting in that seat, Senator Eric Buxton. He served on the levy court. Well, he had reached out to me probably the year prior to me being bond chair, and was saying to me, oh, we have this huge issue down at Bowers Beach and blah, 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 blah. Can I introduce you to the mayor? Well, I have become fast friends with the mayor, who has explained to me about the fact that we needed that particular area to be dredged. We're still dealing with the dredging, but Senator Carper's involved. There's a lot of different issues, because we can't be neglectful that people make their living out on the water. When we were going through the pandemic and people were talking about a food shortage, you needed to get our watermen out in the water, but they can't get there if the dredging's not there. So that became a project internally for the bond committee to figure out. And Representative Ron Gray for years had been asking for money for dredging. And so that was one of the key things that when I looked around the room of the legislators that were sitting there, and wanting to categorize the people that had had requests, but we had not delivered, how did we serve them? Because ultimately our job on the bond committee is not to look across party lines, but to look across the whole state and figure out how to create economic development so people can go to work.
That's right. So back to the CRF applications. Can you speak to the timeline around those applications?
Yeah, the new application, same application, but the process, I believe it is coming out February 6th or 7th, and it will close somewhere around May 15th. I'm giving you soft timelines, but yeah.
And just for everyone on the call, when JL and I have specific dates, we will absolutely ensure that this gets out to the membership.
Yep, February 6th to May 15th.
Great, thank you.
And you can find that. I will try and put the link in the chat. If not, just go to Community Redevelopment Reinvestment Funds.
JL, would you mind putting that link in the chat box, please? Thank you. So any other questions for Senator Poore this morning on the bond process, community reinvestment funds, fun and frivolity in the legislature? I'm kind of opening it up now, Senator. So
sure, anything.
Any other questions that folks have for Senator Poore this morning? It should also be noted, just a fun fact, that Senator Poore leads a nonprofit, and so she does really have insight into the experiences that you all are having. So let's see, looks like we have a question.
So Melissa, okay.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's actually how I became a senator. So I was working for a nonprofit and realized that there were state dollars. We had missed deadlines. And I actually called my rep and said to her, hey, can you do me a favor and introduce me to a couple people? I had created literally a whole marketing plan on who sat on joint finance, who lived in districts of where the children's family lived, not necessarily the children. I started doing calling people, hey, you need to come see this. You need to come, you need to know what is happening in Delaware. And so I finally made my way to the chair of joint finance. And back then that was Representative Dennis Williams. And if everybody or you don't remember him, he had a very good sense of humor, but he was very tight with his money. And so basically went into his office. He and I had a very long, healthy discussion. And I explained to him what would happen, how it was going to happen, and why he had an obligation to the state of Delaware, to the kids. Anyway, long story short, he said to me, I think I'm going to end up working with you. I have a feeling I'm going to see you again.
And for those of you that are, Delaware people, that's actually how Senator Poore and I met, because when she contacted her legislator, I happened to be the staff person for that legislator at the time. And so got to tour the nonprofit she was working for, and it's an incredible place and continues.
It is.
So, Delaware. So I do want to just take a moment, Senator, and it was in the chat box, but also it's worth saying that you and Representative Heffernan put an incredible amount of transparency around the Community Reinvestment Fund process, and we are grateful because I do think that helped organizations understand the opportunity, and more money into our nonprofit sector is really terrific. So thank you.
Well, I think it's important. I mean, programming is one piece of it. But the other piece of it that is really hard is to raise those types of funds for the, the capital improvements. And so how did we disseminate that? Like, I mean, let's be honest, the food bank, they are our savior. They were our savior during the pandemic, and they still continue to do amazing things. And I'm highlighting them because, again, they're still waiting for ARPA dollars. And we were trying to do the best that we could through the bond dollars to be able to, again, reach as many nonprofits as we possibly could. And it's just the small things.
Great. Well, we appreciate it. It's not small when you're looking at it from the perspective of nonprofit leaders. So we appreciate all the work that you've done. So, please, everyone, join me in thanking Senator Poore for her time this morning, talking us through community reinvestment funds and the bond process. So that was very helpful. And Senator, I know that folks will be reaching out to you. I'm always at the Starbucks at the Baptist Center, so I'm sure I'll see you. But thank you
Absolutely.
for your time today. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And Melissa, you're more than welcome to share my cell number through the chat. So if anybody has any questions or concerns, just do me a favor. If you are texting me, please tell me who you are, where you're from. So I don't have to go back and say, I don't have you on my contacts. And I knew who I'm talking with.
I think that's fair. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone. Have a great day. See you in March.
Thanks. So, so we have a brief few minutes before Senator McBride joins us to talk through healthcare. And I thought it might be a great opportunity to just quickly, while we have all of you here, talk about some of the things that Dana is working on this year on behalf of the nonprofit sector. Pardon me. So first is that, and some of these are going to feel very familiar, but I do, if these are issues that impact your organization, we'd love for you to lean in and join us for a community of practice or at a subsector advocacy day. JL will happily share the document that we've been using with legislators to help paint for them the picture of what the experiences are of our nonprofit organizations. Pardon me. The big picture, what we're working on this year. So as usual, we are, still talking about contracts, and many of our nonprofits that are contracted service providers for the state are being paid well below market rate for those services. And we have met with state agency leaders with the governor's office as recent as the fall of 2022 to help them understand why this is impacting the sector so greatly, particularly with the increased cost to provide those services. And I know, like, I see, the shining faces of a number of you who are experiencing this directly. So we have been advocating around, increases to those contracted rates. In addition, JL is working diligently to put together, so taking a step back, we're creating a contracting coalition of organizations that are contracted service providers with the state, both nonprofit and for-profit, as some of the concerns are impacting all of us. And it's not just around the rate of pay, but also there are significant issues in the process. As many of you know, it differs across state agencies. And so that has become a particular concern around agencies falling back that they have to use the boilerplate language, which is in fact not true, that there's very little room for negotiation of these contracts. So if you have an interest in participating in that contracting coalition, independent of just Dana's work in the hall around bigger issues that impact nonprofits, please let JL know. JL, if you wouldn't mind putting your email address in the chat box so folks can reach out to you directly so they could be included on those communications. So we're hoping to improve the contracting process as well as the rate of pay for nonprofit organizations providing those services. So that's the first thing. Next is that we believe that the investment in grant and aid could be increased. And, as we heard from Brenda earlier, they've met the demands of funding the budget stabilization fund, but still have $18 million planned to allocate to that fund. So there is opportunity to invest in grant and aid and make grant and aid work better for the nonprofit sector. Every single session, we see a bill that wants to create a grant and aid committee. It's been Dana's position that we can't say whether a committee is required in order to do the job. However, the process for grant and aid could very much use some improvement. So we are working with Representative Mike Smith to think through what a working group task force to really set some standards on how the grant and aid process could be improved. So we will continue to work on that. And then we are advocating for a bigger investment of dollars into grant and aid. One thing I will share with all of you is that if you are considering applying for grant and aid, or if you are a recipient of grant and aid, one of the pieces of feedback that we did receive from the Comptroller General's office is that members of the Joint Finance Committee are under the impression that grant and aid is a nice to have, but not critical to nonprofit operations. I just love watching everybody's faces as I say that out loud. So the thought was that that our organizations need to do a better job of telling that story around how grant and aid is supporting the day-to-day operations, that it is not serving the purpose of funding the nice to haves, because I'm not really sure any of us have gotten to that point yet where we're just excited to have extras. It's really around operating. And Sheila, did you want to speak to this, what you're putting in the chat box?
Well, I just think that we have to remind our policymakers, because they do have short memories, but even just a couple of years ago, there was a big initiative as part of reducing costs by shifting funds that traditionally were designated for agencies that were doing specific work for the departments, which were called pass-throughs, and all of that was moved into into grant and aid. So grant and aid's growth is a combination of shifting funds out of general operating and then those kind of one-time expenditures to cover last minute legislation. So when we look at the actual, allocations, it's on a per capita basis, it's been declining. And that's something that we have to every year remind our policymakers, and particularly for you as an organization, to share with them. I suspect that 10 years ago, the number of people you served might have been smaller. Certainly the cost to serve them has definitely increased. So we need to help educate policymakers, because the leadership is changing, and they don't have the perspective or history that you might be able to bring to help them understand the why this is so important.
And Kirsten mentioned in the chat box, and thank you, Kirsten, that, there is this belief system that grant and aid is the way in which they fund nonprofits. But in fact, that's not, and I mentioned it a little earlier, that is not the big investment into the nonprofit sector. It's a piece of the puzzle, but I think there is just an overall misunderstanding. And, JL and I love telling the story of the organizations that are in our state doing the work, but I just want to be sure that you are also telling those stories. They're now starting to reach the point where they roll their eyes at me. So they have to hear it from others, and we're happy to help you coordinate that process. The other, so moving along to, sorry, Kirsten, did you have something to add there? Please do.
I did, but what was it? It left my brain really fast.
It's a Monday morning. I appreciate this.
Oh, I know what it was.
Okay.
So when Brenda was giving the OMB presentation and the question around, how do we influence this, how do we influence contractual budgets? And the message was, well, you need to get to them before they put their budgets together. But then the secretaries are told they can only come in with a 1% increase. It's all like this is like a circular argument, like come to us early, but we only have 1% to give you, and we have to cover all of our internal agency costs. So I don't know how, it just feels like we are boxed in this no-win approach to influencing these budgets, or they're trying to box us in.
I would agree with that. And I'll just speak, on behalf of Dana and the work that we are doing for the sector. We started having those conversations in August last year. And then after, and we testified at OMB hearings, and all of the opportunities, we took them to talk about investments into nonprofits and the critical role you're playing. And so, and then there is a gross misunderstanding of the process, particularly around contracts. And so I think that, we still have work to do, obviously. And, we're hoping that this contracting coalition can help bring us all together. The answer is going to be, to a degree, that, organizations that are providing services, I do. So organizations that are providing services to the state need to start saying no. You need to put that out to RFP. We can't extend our contract at rates from a decade ago. That doesn't work any longer. And I know that's really difficult. That's a difficult ask. So, so contracting, very important key issue for our sector. And then we are, next is that we have asked for a liaison or an ombudsman to really be the voice within the administration for the nonprofit sector. And many states are pursuing this. We've been talking about it for, it feels like, a long time. And many of you may recall that during the pandemic, when the Division of Small Business was providing funding to shuttered businesses that weren't providing critical services. Not that they're not important, but they could get $10,000 in 3 days, and the nonprofit sector didn't qualify. And when we brought that to the Division of Small Business's attention, the response was, you are not our constituency. that nonprofits may be businesses, but you are not our constituency. And so it became evident that we didn't have someone that was really looking out for our constituency within the parameters of state government. So that is number 3, like what we're working on. We need some representation, and we are already having those conversations with those people who are indicating that they intend to run for governor. So we're getting ahead of that now so that they can build that into their planning for their future administration. So the final thing that we are really like honing in on this year is around healthcare. And we've heard from many of you that there are the increasing costs to access quality healthcare for your employees has just blown up over the last 2 years. And so we, in the conversations around contracts, we started to think about, okay, well, you know, let's talk to our members and understand what are some of the ancillary drivers of their costs, and how can we work with the state to address those. So one of the answers, you know, if you will, that we had pursued is understanding what are the opportunities for contracted service providers that are nonprofits to purchase healthcare through the state. And so today, and we've been having these conversations for a year, and I'm so excited to introduce like such a friend to Dana and to the nonprofit sector. But Senator Sarah McBride has joined us today. And Senator McBride, for those of you that don't know, is incredible. And she's been a wonderful partner in thinking through the process by which we start to address these healthcare issues with the nonprofit sector. So Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. I'm so excited to be on with so many people who are dear friends of mine. So thank you for having me.
We're so excited to have you as well. Senator, if you wouldn't mind, would you like me, or would you like to walk us through the draft bill that we have been working on together? High level.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy to sort of to dive in and take the lead. So again, thank you so much for having me. Let me close out my Outlook so you don't hear pops as I talk. I'm sure you all are familiar with that. First off, I am actually at the LACC right now, just ahead of early childhood press conference with Lieutenant Governor and Senator Gay. Senator Gay is actually sitting in the conference room just down the table from me right now as we wait to begin. So I'm thrilled that this worked out and I'm able to join you. And, you know, as chair of the Senate Health and Social Services Committee, my top priority in the General Assembly is figuring out how we can get affordable quality healthcare to every person in this state. And as Melissa mentioned, I know talking with you all over the last 2 years, both in introductory conversations, but also in conversations that we've had around legislation that we've considered, from the $15 minimum wage to paid family and medical leave, just how much our nonprofits, particularly our nonprofits who rely on state contracts, how many pressures they are facing financially. And that was even before the higher inflation levels we saw over the last year. And so I am incredibly mindful of that as I move into my second term. And so when Melissa approached me late last year during session about this idea of utilizing the state benefits that we provide to not only state employees, but also employees of many municipalities, of our higher educational institutions, using the healthcare benefits and that large pool of employees to be able to provide an affordable quality option of health insurance to employees of many nonprofits who receive significant government funding, I jumped at the chance. To me, it just makes sense. It makes sense as a public policy. It makes sense as a financial point, but also it makes sense because for so long here in Delaware, we have, from my perspective, sought to address systemic and institutional financial challenges that state government has on your backs. And based on those three intersecting points, it seems to me that, the least we can do is to figure out every practical option we can as state government to lower whatever costs you're facing. And health insurance seems like a clear example of a cost that you are facing that should be and needs to be addressed. A benefit that you're providing that is critical. We don't want to have to see you have to move more and more from employer-based health insurance to putting employees on the individual marketplace, because we want to make sure that you're able to recruit the talent that you need. But also because we have put so much on your backs, I think this makes a lot of sense. And so we've crafted a draft bill that we continue to work on that would open up the state employee health insurance benefit to nonprofits and their employees. So this wouldn't shift the cost of the insurance entirely onto the state, or the insurance onto the state. But what it would allow you to do is access the rates and the coverage that state employees are able to access. And for you all, that doesn't just mean, hopefully in many instances, more affordable care. It doesn't mean even better coverage for your employees. It also hopefully means more sustainable and stable rates over time, as we see fluctuation, but certainly less fluctuation in the health insurance rates that we pay as a state government. Now, we're in conversations with the administration. I know Dana has done an excellent job of both laying foundations with conversations with them, as well as conversations with my colleagues. And we're currently figuring out, because I know one of the million-dollar questions is, what would be the specific parameters of eligibility to be able to participate in this? Those are conversations we're having right now and trying to figure out. But my goal is that we can at least get something passed that provides as many of our nonprofits who contract with the state, who receive significant state funding, as many of those nonprofits as possible into that eligibility criteria, so we can begin to address this challenge that you face, that your employees face, and that we as state government face as a byproduct. And so I'm happy to answer any questions or open it up to Melissa for any follow-up questions or points.
So, Senator, if it's okay, may I just speak to the eligibility that we have requested? Could that get us to a starting point?
Sure.
Okay.
That's your information to share. Absolutely.
That's right. Okay. So, so please know this is not what is agreed upon just yet, but what Dana has indicated is that organizations that are contracted service providers for the state, organizations that receive grant and aid in excess of $5,000, and or organizations that receive federal pass-through dollars. So they are on a contract where the feds fund through the state. So that we are trying to create eligibility that is as broad as possible. However, what Senator McBride can't speak to, and what I will happily speak to, is that we understand that this doesn't capture 100% of the nonprofit organizations in Delaware. So we are looking at other options for how Dana can create some sustainable healthcare options for nonprofit organizations. We're still working through that, so not a ton of information on that front just yet. But the hope is that we might be able to create an association healthcare plan for organizations to pursue. Now, all of these are simply intended to provide additional options to organizations that are nonprofits in Delaware working. It doesn't require anything. It does not require, an organization to purchase healthcare through the state. What it does is create an opportunity in that you see the rate sheet, you can compare and then shop around, and it gives you more bargaining power to really choose what is the best opportunity for your employees and your organization. So we're super grateful that Senator McBride's been a partner on this front. And, we have been talking to legislators about this. We have talked to the administration about this. And how do I put this? We have been able to capture a lot of data through, we have Share Delaware, which is a source of nonprofit data. There is Open Data Delaware that we can capture information, but we do need some more information from all of you. So in the coming weeks, Dana is going to be putting out a survey where we are asking questions around your experiences with contracting, as well as if you were to have this opportunity, would you take advantage of it potentially? Would it be on the options list for you? And then a little bit more about what your team looks like in terms of how many people are we talking about? Are they female? Are they male? Are they what age range do they fall into? And this is going to help us inform some of the discussions with the administration. Did I capture that correctly, Senator?
Yeah, and I was just gonna build off of that if that's all right, Melissa, because I
Please.
see George's question about sort of what do we expect resistance or obstacles to be. I think first off, what I would say, the early conversations from the administration that we've had, or the preliminary conversations, have been open with a number of questions. And to Melissa's point, the number one sort of threshold question that I think are going to face on this proposal is what if any impact would there be to the state and or current state and state employees? And the main question, even though you all will be paying the employer portion and your employees will be paying the employee portion if you choose to participate in the benefit, the question would be, does a change to the pool change the risk and therefore change the premiums? Frankly, I would be shocked if the pool was large enough coming in that it would meaningfully impact the size of the overall pool and the risk of the pool, given the fact that we have the entirety of state government coupled with, I think, JL provided me a list of 72. I think it's almost 90 at this point. Non-state government entities that participate. Now, many of them are either government entities or pseudo-public private entities. But I cannot imagine that if you take that existing pool, we add you all into that option, it has a meaningful impact on the risk. Having said that, that is an assumption. And I think understandably, the administration wants to have some data behind that assumption before I think a lot of folks would feel comfortable, because they don't want, given the current dynamic with health benefits, retiree benefits, across the board, all the benefits that we're seeing right now, the last thing they would want is an assumption, and then it somehow increases premiums across the board. Again, we don't anticipate that. We don't think that will happen, but I think that's a threshold question that we need to provide a bit more data, so that's not just a guess or an assumption. I think some of the other concerns or obstacles I would anticipate coming up, one come into George's question, I think one come in that eligibility space. I think there are different factors around, I think there are different parts of that, of the different entities that receive state funding are entering that. So let's take grant and aid is a different equation. It's a different consideration as to whether an entity gets grant and aid and how much they get than the process for a contract with the Department of Health and Social Services. And the sort of different factors in those different areas, I think, raise different questions when it comes to something like this. And so I think there's going to be a lot of conversation around the eligibility, and I think that's an area where there'll be concerns and obstacles that sort of are different for different sectors of the state funded nonprofit community, or the nonprofit community that receives some kind of state funding. And then the final thing I'd say is that obviously benefits are complicated and benefits require change a lot of times. And I could see there being some just concern around more stakeholders potentially having a say in future changes to state benefits. Now, my response to that would be, that's not a reason not to do this. Just because your decision down the road might be a little bit harder or a little bit more complicated. Although again, we're not talking about people who are forced to be on these plans. We're talking about people who choose to opt in, and that's obviously a different stakeholder sort of input than, you know, a state employee, full-time state employee would have in this context. But I think there would be some concerns and conversations around what does this mean when we have to inevitably make difficult decisions with benefits long term. But again, I don't think that that's an excuse not to do this. Ultimately, like if we want to treat you like the fourth branch of government in certain instances, then we can't say, oh, well, if it makes it harder for us to treat you like that in other instances, even if it's fair to you, we're not going to do it. And so I think those are conversations I would anticipate as we move forward. But I think, frankly, the only issue that really could get in the way writ large as a threshold question is this question of, does allowing the pool to be expanded increase benefit costs for the state at a time when the state is already struggling with benefits costs?
Which is a fair question, and we're hoping that the survey data that we capture from all of you will help inform that.
Yes.
So, Sarah, there is a question around, do we anticipate any risk of current healthcare providers leaving the market as a result? I don't foresee that, but do you have concerns there?
Current healthcare providers leaving the market if we allowed nonprofits to participate, I can't imagine that would be a downstream consequence of this. It's certainly not been a point that has been raised. You know, the state benefits are exceptionally generous and providers participate in that. And I would expect that the more Delaware workers accessing really, really solid benefits, frankly, providers would welcome that. And it would certainly reduce bureaucracy and inefficiencies the larger the pool is. Now, obviously, the response to that could be, well, the larger the pool, the greater leverage they have in decreasing rates. I think similar to the point around not increasing premium, I don't think the expansion, the universe being expanded would make that much of a difference in the insurance pool's leverage in then negotiating rates down with providers. So I don't think we would see a material difference in that. But the only difference I think providers would see is slightly more patients having a benefit that they're very used to interacting with and that covers fairly generously.
So then there is a question around, are other states doing this? And Senator, if you're okay, I can respond to this.
Yeah.
We have been working, we have a partnership with the National Council of Nonprofits, and therefore there are in 34 other states, there's a me and a JL that are working on policy issues impacting the nonprofit sectors in their state. When we brought this to them for discussion, no other state had pursued purchasing state benefits. So they're, you know, sort of watching with bated breath to see how Delaware, you know, really engages in this. Now, other states do provide healthcare through association healthcare options through their the Dana-like organization in their state through an association. So that is, we are, you know, in fact, in this like vein, to our knowledge, we are leading the charge.
And I will just build off of that just to sort of add a sort of talking point in people's arsenal as they maybe engage on this, which is, does any other state do this? I'd argue we already do this. We just don't do it with nonprofits. We do it with nearly 90 non-state specific entities. And so while this particular proposal might not exist in other states, what we're talking about here is not creating an entire new policy or regiment. What we're talking about is taking something we already do and expanding it to include sort of the next group of entities outside of what we're already doing. And then the second thing I'd say is that while no other state does this with health insurance, as you all know, I worked on the paid leave bill. there is a bill that passed and was signed into law in New Hampshire where they are allowing private employers to buy into the state's family and medical leave insurance program. So the state of New Hampshire provides this benefit through short-term disability insurance to their employees, and they are allowing private employers to buy into the state's rates. And so there are some similar examples, not necessarily, and it's not just nonprofits there. There are similar examples, not necessarily the same scope of benefit, but there are some similar examples that we've seen elsewhere on other benefits. So I think there's enough precedent for us to say, we're not doing anything too risky here. But we are pursuing a creative proposal to better support our nonprofits. And I will say, Melissa and JL have been fantastic and incredibly thoughtful leaders, I should say. I'm a partner to them in pursuing this, and their proactive approach to educating my colleagues, to figuring out how we can, get appropriate data without putting too much of a burden on people while things are still up in the air. Every part of this effort, they have just been amazing to work with during. And so I just want to thank them.
Well, back at you. You've been incredible and we're really grateful. So Senator McBride does need to leave momentarily, but Lori, did you have a question?
Actually, I just wanted to share, and I don't know if the senator may know this, but we just had an experience where Child Inc. was asked in coalition with a few other nonprofit agencies to bid on it was through DHSS, it was a Division of Public Health contract. And specifically in the RFP, the other employment costs, which for us are, healthcare, disability, pension, were capped at 27% of salary. Now, I have all sorts of documentation, but I'll use a quick example. For a case manager of mine who earns $40,000 a year, who takes parent-child health benefits that the agency pays the premium for, plus her pension and other disability and life insurance, her benefits total $24,000. Do the quick math, that is 60% of her salary. So we are going to be, as a nonprofit sector, boxed out on several fronts if state agencies in their RFPs are going to now cap what we can cover in our other employment costs. I mean, we're sort of at a loss. So that I just wanted to make you aware. We haven't seen it become a regular thing, but this was the first time, and the RFP was very recent. And my worry is that, this is a new wrinkle. This is how they are trying to put guardrails on their RFPs, but the nonprofit sector, because our costs are so high, because our groups are small, our health insurance premiums went up 42% this year. And I can't run a nonprofit and provide services if I can't bid on these contracts, but I also have to provide competitive benefits, and it costs me a lot more than it costs the state. So I just wanted to put that out there, that it really is a double bind.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, Lori, that is a powerful example of what we were talking about, which is it's unfair to you, but it's also unfair to the state, right? I mean, the idea that we would lose out on a fantastic nonprofit bidding for a contract that they would do a wonderful job executing, that's a loss for the state and for state government and for the public. And forcing you all to decide whether you are eligible for a contract that you'd be great at doing, or forcing you to reduce your benefits and therefore make you less competitive in hiring talent. I mean, these are impossible choices. And they are impossible choices that put you in a bad spot, if not an untenable spot. They put state government in a bad spot, and they put the people that all of us are tasked with serving in a bad spot. And so thank you for that example, because I think it's a powerful one, and I'll certainly bring it with me in my discussions on this.
Well, we appreciate that. So Senator, I do know that you need to jump for a press conference, but I just want to take a moment to thank you for being an amazing partner and for taking the time this morning to come and chat with our members. So everyone, if you could just, please thank Senator McBride for her time today.
Thank you all.
Appreciate you.
Thank you all. Appreciate you. And just let this be an example of, you all shared with us time and time again the challenges that you're facing. You shared with me, and hopefully my colleagues will listen. So your advocacy makes a difference. Your voice makes a difference here, and let's make sure people listen and act. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've had a busy morning, friends. We've heard a lot about our state budget, around Community Reinvestment Fund opportunities, and now around some of the policy priorities that Dana is pursuing on behalf of the nonprofit sector. And I did want to just open it up to any general questions that you may have with our final few minutes. And then I'll be repeating some housekeeping items for those of us that joined us a little later in the morning. So any questions that we can answer?
I saw Verna's post in the chat, and I don't know if she's still on, but I'm wondering if Dana might be able, if Verna could provide you or JL the information, and then you could push that information out.
Happily. Verna, did you want to unmute and just speak to that?
I am. I was searching desperately for the raise hand. You think I know where the raise hand button was at this point, right? And I apologize. My camera's misbehaving this morning too. So it's Monday. And thank you, Lori, for the question. So, we and Melissa and I've had this conversation like for months and months now, like we've got to make more noise. And the way we make more noise is by banding together as nonprofits, basically. So I think it's fabulous that Dana's talking about pulling together this coalition. And so Ability Network of Delaware, Eastern Seals is part of Ability Network of Delaware, and we've been working to pull together basically the public conversation, right? To talk about these issues, specifically going back to the reimbursement rate roadmap that I don't know if you all remember back JFC created a few years back, which requires EHS specifically to do a regular review of the reimbursement rates for their social services providers. But we haven't really heard a whole lot about it lately. So part of the conversation is going to be a discussion with Secretary McGarrick about what's the status of that roadmap. But then it's also about how do we identify a different means, a different funding mechanism? How do we identify, how these services are going to be funded in the future? Because we can't continue under the same situation that we've had where they're honestly, it's just great. You go down, there's winners and there's losers. You go down every year and there's winners and losers that get selected. And then you're left to try to, piece together and to continue doing the services that you're providing, making cuts within your own organization. So it's intended, again, to be a conversation to bring nonprofits together. I'm happy to provide the invitation registration information to Dana, which can be shared. I should have that in the next day or so. Or feel free to email me. My email's there in the chat, and I will make sure that it gets forwarded out to you all directly. Again, it's conversation. Senator McBride's going to be there. Representative Johnson's going to be there. We're hoping to have, several of the legislators as well to participate. Some from each side of the aisle, and leadership as well.
And Verna, once you have, maybe a flyer, whatever it is, whatever the what is, we'll happily share that out with us.
Fabulous.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. This is definitely, contracting is an issue that spans not only like, disability services providers and our social services nonprofits, but we are hearing from the for-profit. I mean, I know it seems kind of crazy, but they are experiencing some of the same issues. So, which makes it very difficult for them to contract with the state. So, bringing everybody together and making the appropriate amount of noise is the way that this is going to get done. So finally, we're down to our last 4 minutes. So I want to thank everyone for your time and your engagement. And I'm so grateful that all of you play my reindeer games to a degree and call your legislators when I ask and lean in on these policy issues that are really for the greater good for all of our organizations. So, I would ask that you really consider peeking into our community of practice. I will be reaching out to ask you to complete a survey as we move forward with this health insurance opportunity. And then finally, if you would please take a moment to complete the post-event survey. We really do read those. We consider those, and it informs the work that we do moving forward. I particularly love to look at them. So please take a moment and complete the post-event survey so that it can inform the work we're doing moving forward. And then we will follow up with the survey link again, because, and with the slides that Brenda walked through this morning. As we get information from legislators, we will certainly share that out to the folks that participated on the call today. And then if you have questions or concerns, or as you're pursuing policy initiatives and you need support, please don't hesitate to reach out to JL and I. That's why we're here, to help you do this work and to be really effective in pursuing what you need from a policy perspective from our legislature and from the administration, even in some cases, local county governments. So please, loop us in, ask us for help, let us provide resources. That's why we're here. So thank you all so much for the time this morning. And this is just the beginning. We're just getting started in our advocacy efforts. So thank you so much.